Hi, Bob here. Shit, what was I gonna... I'm totally doing a rant. I had something, it just ran away from me. So, let's go into world building. And I'm going to try and keep it short. World building is one of the most important things that you as an author can do. You should think about the world that you are building and the consequences therein. I've talked about verisimilitude. I've talked about doing your research. There are actually some really fascinating books on, like, there's one specifically on the physics of the world necessary for world building, for science fiction writers, having to do with things like specific gravity, how gravity affects certain other biological effects, and the shapes of things, how other planetary bodies affect life on a specific planet, all sorts of other stuff. It's a fascinating read, and I don't remember the title of the book because I'm an idiot, and this just came to me to start doing the rant, so boom. Anyway, in doing your world building, make certain that you know what your world is like, how it is the same and how it is different from a regular world. That kind of sounds like I'm talking about that one big exception thing. To an extent I am, right? But this is a bit more specific to the world that we are talking about. For example, if you are on an Earth-like world that is not Earth, is it different? How is it different? How has that changed the way that the native species have evolved? Assuming a more science fiction-y scenario. Or, how did the gods shape things in a more fantasy-based scenario? Setting. Oh, shit. Never drop your cigarette between your legs. That can be a bad time. On the other hand, cigarettes are fascinating in that if you drop your cigarette, fall asleep and drop your cigarette, you're going to burn the house down. When cigarette ash is consumed, it is entirely inert as soon as it falls off of the cigarette. So the only part that can work is the ember. That has nothing to do with world building. What am I doing? Trying to think of a good example. C.J. Cherryh wrote the Foreigner series, starting with the eponymous novel, Foreigner, and continuing on in a series of trilogies that are all fantastic. Basic premise is humans wind up stranded on an alien planet where the native sentient race, at the time that the humans wound up stranded, were just entering the steam age. And 300 years later, humanity has been slowly attempting to uplift this species so that they can both get back into space. Slowly because the humans lost the war. 2, the native race, the Atavi, don't think like humans at all. C.J. Cherryh, if I remember correctly, is a psychologist, and she works with the psychology of these species. Her writing is couched in it, in a way that makes things fascinating. She is the only author I have ever seen who has been able to make, right from the perspective of an alien species, in a way that made it so that the human character seemed alien. But that's not what the world I'm talking about now. That's a different one. In the Atavi world, there are a handful of things that entirely changed the way that the species evolved and came into being, and it changes the way that the interplay works between humans and these other species. Specifically, first off, they have a much more alkali-based biology, meaning that many of the foods that they need to be healthy are incredibly poisonous to humans because of the alkaloids involved, right? Secondly, their inherent biology is fueled by a different type of base instinct. Their instinct set is very different. Part of that's because of the way that the planet is set up. It's slightly larger than Earth, the gravity is slightly different, and so the Atavi are substantially larger than humans. But the real big difference is in the way that they think. They are incredibly mathematically oriented, to the point of all of their superstitions and things like that being based around numbers. And while humans will function with the concept of dead reckoning having no problem with that, the Atavi need specific, exact numbers. You know, there's no guesswork, there's no estimations. They want to know exactly how a specific thing will work. For example, you know, in our world, the average fall speed, fall velocity is 9.2 meters per second, roughly. The Atavi would want the exact 9.2185, something like that, meters per second. That 0.0185 doesn't seem important to most people because you can get the basic speed down just fine at 9.2, you know. Or pi is 3.18, right? Or 22 sevenths. But the difference between 22 sevenths and 3.18 is very, is substantially different. They want to find the end of pi. You know, they are more than happy to explore even the concept of pi until they're able to figure out out to 100 decimal points what pi is, where it loops. Pi is an irrational number, so it doesn't ever actually loop, but they are much more likely to need and want an extremely specific degree way out there beyond what humans would even care about. This makes the Atavi unique. This makes them very different than humans. And it's this difference that gives the world life. In your own world building, you should do the same. Not necessarily creating a species that thinks that way, but you should have concepts and information that makes your world unique. This can be as simple as a bestiary. What species exist in your world that don't exist in ours? You know, basilisks and dragons and mermaids and unicorns, whatever. Or entirely unique life forms. If undead roam the world, why? How? If there are some strange entities, why are they like that? There are humans on your world. How are they different than regular humans? An author who really, really, really works this well, and I've definitely mentioned him in the past, is Brandon Sanderson. I've mentioned his Mistborn before. He has a species in his Mistborn novels early on called Mistwraiths, and they're these gelatinous blobs that wander around, and they'll pick up the bones of the dead and kind of move around, joining the bones together and creating these weird monstrosities from them. Why do they do that? There are some explanations. Some of it's plot-based, so I'm not going to go too into it. But they're a normal creature. In his Stormlight Archives, the world has a storm that crosses over it regularly, constantly. You know, every few days, an extremely potent storm crashes over the world. And it's the storm itself powers their magic, giving energy to the specific crystals. And that's interesting in and of itself. But how does that work on the plants and animals and life forms? Well, Sanderson decided that his creatures will all be more crab-like. So, like, he has a group of creatures called axe hounds, which fill the same void as hounds do in our world. They're kind of the dogs of this world, but they all have a carapace. They're all crustacean-like. They still run on 4 legs, as far as I know. I think I've seen sketches, but you know, they still run on 4 legs, but those legs are segmented instead of jointed like ours, or like dogs. The grasses in most of the world are on stalks, sort of like anemone, and when the storm hits, they pull into the stalk, fall over, and disappear until the storm passes. The trees do the same thing. Like, this is very, very different than our world. In fact, a character finds a place where what we would consider normal grass exists, and she calls it stupid grass. She thinks it's dumb because it doesn't hide when you try and walk past it. It doesn't try and protect itself at all. It just lays there and, you know, gets stepped on and doesn't fight back. This is a very different world, and it creates all sorts of different environments that change the way that your story can play out. But Sanderson doesn't just stop at saying, hey, look at this cool thing that's different than the world that we're in. He extrapolates. And this is where you go from being a good author that has a couple of interesting ideas to being a great author that will hold people's attention. you have to extrapolate. You have to go, okay, if the world is like this, then what does that mean for this and this and this and this? As I mentioned with Sanderson, the grasses lock up and hide. So how do plant eaters survive? Maybe they live by, crunching through the carapace that the plants have and eating the plants like that. That's not necessarily a bad way to do it. Maybe plants get kind of hunted. The animal will wait until the stalks open up and then, hop in and snatch them and eat them that way. Or maybe the animal will have learned a way to trick the plants into thinking that they're safe so that they'll open up and it can eat them that way. And that's just one step. What is it? So now that animal has made those, has generated those ideas, what happens with it being hunted? How does it survive the storms that the plants have to hunker down and avoid? And on and on and on and on. You can, of course, be looking at it deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. It's a rabbit hole that doesn't have an end. And if you're not careful, you can spiral down into nowhere and never get anything done. So while you need to have a good world building scenario, you need to have a good idea for how the world works and extrapolate on it, you don't necessarily want all of it available all at once, right? You're telling a story. You're not actually building a world, unless you are, in which case you're writing a completely different kind of book, which can also be interesting, but it's more like a campaign setting than a novel. Those are important. Those have their place. They are quite valuable. They can be a lot of fun. But if you're writing a novel, you need those ideas just so you can reference them and address them and then ignore them. You know the extrapolations. You know the concepts. Your characters are familiar with them. Your audience doesn't necessarily have to be. But, as your world is built, there's the biology, there's all of that stuff, the geology, the geography, all of those things. Then there's the human element, which involves things like turns of phrase, well, if you're going to say that you're going to be somewhere quickly, there's the expression 2 shakes of a lamb's tail. If you haven't heard that, I don't blame you. You're probably from a city, or you're just not old. Kids these days probably have never heard that expression, or city folks. On the other hand, I don't know. Maybe you have. If you read a lot, you might well have. The expression 2 shakes of a lamb's tail makes sense in a setting that has lambs. But if there are no lambs, if there are no sheep, what's the equivalent? Find that equivalent, use it, make it stick, make it last. And that's the foundation of how you build your world. You need a history, you need biology, you need all of these things. You don't need them to be the be-all and end-all. But you need enough depth that you can fake more depth than you even have. Your story is a puddle, but some puddles are deeper than others. And if it's a long enough and large enough looking puddle, that people can't see to the bottom of, they're going to be, the imagination will stretch and imagine the infinite. You know, how deep is a lake? Well, I can't ever swim to the bottom of it. With the right tools, I could. But if I am, sailing across the surface, all I can do is see into the depths. I can fish something up, but I can only imagine what's down there. That's what you as a world builder should be doing. That's what you as a writer should have at your fingertips. Don't worry about having every answer right away. But always have a way to make an answer based on other things in your story. That's what good world building is. You set yourself up so that if there is something you need to answer, if someone has a question, if something comes up, you should have an answer for it on hand. Not necessarily because you've ever even thought of it, but because it will be consistent with everything else that you've talked about. Yeah, that's the idea. Bob out.